I see you got the color memo for a spring Easter pastel.
No, I did not.
If I knew you were wearing red today, I don't think I would have worn lavender.
I don't. I don't really.
You don't even care about these things.
No, I
know.
I'm probably not a great, I'm always fascinated whenever I show up to church and there's all these people who are wearing like liturgically correct colors.
Right.
I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, that's not a thought that goes through my mind.
You know, they think ahead, Scott.
I guess
something that you are
they're
challenged
really,
by.
yeah. I mean, I'm not a great Catholic in that sense.
Well, you're just leaning into Pentecost, I guess. So.
Maybe whenever on my deathbed, I'll request the correct color. Give me green, like if it's ordinary time.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. No, anyway. Yeah,
right.
So here's our topic for today.
Oh, I'm excited.
Well, last week we talked about the war in Iran.
Yes.
And self-defense.
Yes, we
and
did.
I was feeling the need for a follow-up episode on that. The Holy Father has been talking a lot about peace. It's been It's been his big mission is to preach peace throughout the world, which I totally appreciate and understand because war and violence does seem to be breaking out all over the place in lots of ways, in ways that maybe we haven't seen with quite the same intensity in the past, 30 or 40 years. I don't know. It just seems to be like there's a lot of unsettledness, and he's been preaching peace.
Yeah.
And so I thought it might be good to unpack what does Jesus actually teach about peace. And I think this is important because I think that there can be, like always, some real misperceptions about what Jesus actually teaches and what he doesn't, or what he means by what he says. And not that I am the perfect, infallible interpreter of what Jesus means. I don't mean that. But,
oh, gosh.
But I do think that, when you look at the whole of his teaching, there's certain things that he's really trying to convey. And there's other things that we might assume he's trying to say, but he's in fact not saying. And so we have to, I want to unpack that.
So can you tell me, because I have no idea what Pope Leo has been saying about peace. But I've heard, it's so funny you mention that because at the confirmation mass that we just went to this past weekend, the priest in his homily made some mention of that. And it was kind of like he was talking about Pope Leo, calling for peace, but in a way where it's like it was also somewhat of a political statement, in light of what's going on in the Middle East. And, so whenever he kept talking about it, like Pope Leo mentioned peace and we have to have peace, but he was not specific. It was very generic. And I'm like, okay, you mentioned it several times, but I have no idea what that means to me personally.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, I mean,
what has he said?
He's been just making this general appeal to peace, to put down arms, that war doesn't solve any problems, that there's better ways to resolve our conflicts than war.
But does he really think that that's possible?
Well, I'm not going to pretend to know exactly everything that the Pope has in mind by what he says. He did clarify, and I think it's interesting because there's been this whole scuttlebutt with President Trump and J.D. Vance and going on because they've been pushing back on some of the Pope's statements because the way it plays in the media, of course, it sounds like the Pope is just calling out, Donald Trump and targeting Trump with his comments. Yeah. And his clarification was that he's not. There's lots of problems and lots of things going on in the world where people are instigating violence and instigating war as a way of dealing with problems. And he's saying this is not the way. And of course, as Christians, we can't disagree with that. Yeah. But we also can't speak in platitudes. And that's, if I've had any discomfort with the Pope's words, it's that they're too generic.
Yeah.
and they're not, and that's okay in the context where he's making these statements, whether it's in a homily or whether it's in an interview with journalists or whatever. It's not the place to dig into a whole treatise on the nature of peace and the church's teaching on that, which is why maybe it might be good for us to do this here.
Okay, so I mean, I don't want this to get too specifically about just the Middle East, but I mean, this is maybe more of a generic question, and we're probably going to work our way backwards, is what I'm guessing. You're going to define what Jesus means by peace, but the immediate thing for me is, I'm assuming that the United States has a real true desire for some type of peace. Like they don't want things to escalate to the point where, oh, let's say the world is destroyed. And but it feels like the other side might not hold to that conviction, because they're like, no, we're so into what we believe that if that means the world ends, then the world ends. So like, what do you do if one side is like wanting to have a peaceful coexistence or to experience peace or promote peace, and the other side just doesn't want to have anything to do with it?
What do you do? Well, I mean, that depends on what you're dealing with and what
Okay.
you're up against. I mean, yeah, looking at the situation with Iran, you can legitimately ask the question, do they desire to live peacefully among other nations? And it would seem that they would with some, but not all. And they see us and they see the West in general as a great enemy to really to destroy and to undermine and to assault if they can. So I think that in this particular situation, that's true.
Yeah.
If you jump over and you look at the situation, like say in other parts of the Middle East, like whether you're talking about, the Gaza Strip, or you're talking about, the ceasefire with Lebanon and all of that, again, you're dealing with decades, if not centuries old conflicts among different people that have a very tribal mindset and have a very difficult time coexisting with one another, and they have forever. And so what does peace even mean for a group of people that come out of that mindset? It's just a totally different mentality than in the West. And I think one of the things that we struggle with in the West is we think a certain way. We just can't understand why everybody doesn't think the way we think, whether it's about markets or the rule of law or democratic institutions or any of those kinds of things. There are people that operate out of a very different mindset. And I think that we have to be honest about the fact that we can't always reconcile our differences, because the differences are mutually exclusive and incompatible with each other. And that's part of what I think perpetuates this constant problem with certain factions of terrorist groups and stuff like that in the Middle East. Their understanding of what constitutes peace is incompatible with the way we see reality. And so what are you going to do? I mean, but whereas if you look at like China, I mean, there's a lot of ways in which we can coexist with the Chinese culture. They just have a different mindset and a different mentality, and I think it's just a different type of a situation than when we're dealing with any kind of radical fundamentalism. Where if I always say, well, like when people are willing to die in order to kill other people, or they're willing to kill themselves to kill other people, I don't know how you reason with people like that.
Right.
So
exactly.
So that's that's. But I think that I always like to back into complicated issues by starting with the foundational principles and trying to understand a situation from the ground up, or from the principles to the conclusion that the moral judgments that we should make. And I think what happens is everybody just wants to debate the moral judgment, the conclusion. And oftentimes, like you could say that in one way, the argument that the Pope's making and the argument that Trump is making, in some ways, are different arguments. You know, I think J.D. Vance has tried to insert himself here a little bit by saying, American foreign policy is one set of considerations and looking at geopolitics versus the church's perspective on how do you, what is going to make for the greatest peace among nations,
Yeah.
And so we're talking at different levels or to different levels of the problem, and sometimes that results in talking past each other and not and that's why I think starting with principles and arguing to conclusions from those principles is really critical. And unfortunately, my one critique of the church is that sometimes when the Vatican speaks into these issues, she's too far down the line, doesn't lay out with clarity for the people of God, like, what are the founding principles? How do we really understand? And so it ends up coming off, I think, sometimes as these kind of moral platitudes that ring hollow, because you're like, okay, but how are you going to deal with this situation concretely and practically, which is what you asked.
Well, right. And so I'm curious as to what the sort of Catholic textbook definition of peace is, because when what you just said, what Trump is shooting for, what Pope Leo is talking about, what even Iran, peace might not be the correct word in those. I feel like Pope Leo definitely has an idea of what peace means, but that might be very different from mere coexistence or getting along. You know what I mean? Those might be two totally different things.
Well, right. I mean, so more traditionally, a simple definition of peace really is the unity of wills. And it requires that you have a common grasp and a common orientation towards the common good. So you have to, there's peace when everybody is seeking the same end and collaborating and cooperating towards that. And you say, well, what is that end? And, for now, I think realistically, that end is the coexistence of all peoples within a kind of pluralism of, whether it's nations or ethnicity or cultures or moral value systems.
Yeah.
The best we can do in our world today is figure out an arrangement where we can at least minimally respect one another's differences and tolerate those differences, at least to the degree to which someone's way of life or way of looking at things does not overly infringe upon another group of people's, trying to live their way of being.
Yeah.
So it's like, as a Christian person operating out of the Christian tradition, I could say, well, wouldn't it be great if everybody was Christian? It's like, well, even when everybody's Christian, we don't get along. Most of church history is the history of Christians actually fighting and killing one another, honestly. So it's like we have to agree on the same ends, and then we have to agree on the means of getting there. And that's difficult because that means we have to have some shared principles. And in the West, by and large, we do have a set of shared principles,
Right.
and things like, freedom of religion and freedom of conscience and freedom of press and representative government and certain democratic institutions. And that's been a hard one, battle to get to that point. Whereas when you're dealing with, most Islamic groups, I think, are okay with that kind of an arrangement, but there are certain groups that are not, and they, we would call them, we label them as being more fundamentalist or more radicalized, so they're more ideological and less compromising, and so anyhow, to have peace, it's a kind of unity of wills. We're never going to be one on everything, but there's got to be this kind of minimum arrangement of where we agree. And right now I think that the real rubbing point is can there be peace in the world if Iran has a nuclear weapon? And what seems to be the case on the surface of it is the United States says no because they will use it. And I said this last time, that's different than North Korea because I don't think anybody really gets the feeling that North Korea feels that it's in its best interest to use a nuclear weapon. They're using a nuclear weapon more as a way of just protecting and defending themselves against, just leave us alone and let us be who we want to be. And everyone's like, okay, fine. We don't feel an immediate pressing threat from them.
Yeah.
Whereas with Iran, it's different. They talk belligerently, like they want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and they intend to do that, and they want a nuclear weapon to do it. So can we imagine a peaceful scenario minimally, in this minimal sense, with Iran having a nuclear weapon? Well, obviously the United States and many of our allies say no, and have been saying no for a long time.
Yeah.
Whereas Iran's saying, well, you can't, you have no right to prevent us from doing this, and you're not going to stop us, and we're going to get one.
So I might be really dumbing this down, but it seems to me like fundamentally what we're talking about is just the belief system at the heart of it. So it's like the threat of North Korea being on the offensive with a nuclear weapon. There's no real belief system behind that where they would be like, no, this is justified because we believe this certain thing. Whereas with a country where you're right, where the religion is radicalized, where it's like, no, we want to go on the offensive to obliterate a certain group of people that we think are, worth killing, because whatever it is. Like that kind of seems like that's the scary part. In other words, if there's a belief system, and you kind of hinted this, like the history of Christianity a lot of times is them killing each other. It's like whenever you have this conviction of forced conversion by any means necessary, like these people have to be converted, then that opens the door, I think, to like violent approaches to that. And I feel like Christianity has kind of come to this place where we have a pretty good grasp on the fact that the way we convert people is by the heart, like not by overthrowing them.
Yeah,
but it seems like that's the problem with Iran, is that it's led by a group of people who aren't comfortable enough just being Muslims amidst, or next door to Jews or Christians or whatever it is. It's like there's this sort of mindset that these people need to be eradicated or overthrown, or you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
I might be wrong, but that's my...
Yeah, no, I think that's a very astute observation, actually. And that, well, I mean, it's the problem of theocracy, really. It's the problem of, when we resolved that issue for us in the West largely by distinguishing between the authority of the church and the authority of the state. And, at one time they were conflated. And so every theological issue became a political and one of national identity or one of ethnic identity.
Yeah.
And for so much of Western, well, just church history, sort of post-Constantine, the way politics and religion meshed, it just created constant war.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that some of the Arab countries that have moderated, they've embraced somewhat of a similar path where it's like our religious convictions and our political convictions don't necessarily well, let me put it this way, that in the early church we called it Caesaropapism. It was the problem of Caesar having authority over the Pope. Okay. And then you had the problem of the church and state crisis in the post-Reformation period where whoever whatever the faith of the prince was the faith of the people, and so the state is now trying. So trying to enforce religion. So whenever government is trying to mandate faith
Yeah.
of one sort or another, as Christians, we say that's a violation
Yeah.
of human rights and human dignity, because you can't use the state as a way of forcing the conscience outside anything that constitutes the minimum requirement for the common good.
Right.
So there are simple violations of the natural law which cannot be tolerated, like murder, for example.
Sure.
So, suicide bombings, like, that's a,
Yeah.
if you want to eat kosher food, that's kosher, with everybody, it's fine. But when you want to try to force people to believe in what you believe by using violence as a way of doing that, it's a fundamental violation of human dignity and human rights. And so we in the West resolved that issue by rejecting theocracy as a Christian value. And so, let me put it this way. I have to qualify that, because we live in a theocracy, but that's because Christ is king, reigning from heaven, not because the Pope is a king. When the Pope was held up like a king, we had problems. But see, we would say, well, the Pope is really more like a prime minister of the earthly dimension of the church, which exists principally in heaven under the kingship of Christ.
Yeah.
But Christ did not use temporal means for bringing about the building up of his kingdom. That's the whole story of his Paschal mystery, that he didn't deploy or employ temporal means as a way of establishing his kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And so it took a long time for the church to realize that the church had to do the same thing. That is, we hand to civil government the temporal authority to rule the earthly city, and the church reserves the right to be the spiritual authority over those things which pertain to the kingdom of God. And so the way I very simply try to describe this is, when it comes to executing justice in the temporal order of affairs, that belongs to the temporal ruler, like the government.
Yeah.
Okay? So they wield the sword.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to rendering sort of moral and spiritual judgments, that is reserved for the priest, and the primary vehicle and mechanism by which that's done is the confessional.
Yeah.
It's the authority to absolve people of sins. And so you could say in one way that the civil ruler is subject to the priest, but not in terms of temporal authority, but in terms of spiritual authority, because the ruler in the end has to confess his sins to the priest and be absolved by the priest. But what's happened in the past is you have priests that are wielding the sword of justice and the temporal power.
Yeah.
And we finally in the West figured out,
right,
we can't do it that way. That's a confusion. Whereas certain groups, Muslim groups, have not embraced that separation, and so they function as a theocracy, a political entity that believes it has the right to enforce faith and to treat as an enemy anybody that would oppose their religion.
So how do you possibly find peace in that, as long as that exists? How can there be peaceful? I mean, they would have to radically change the way they think for that to happen. Am I wrong?
Well, they would. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or other more sober and sane voices have to prevail. But this is why I think that, over the experience of the past 50 years, this idea of a radicalized Islam is incompatible with where most of the other nations of the world are in terms of what's acceptable within the community of nations. Now, we've tried to deal with it in different ways. We've tried diplomatic means. We've tried, peace treaties. We've tried to come up with solutions where everybody seems to, give up a little in order for everybody to win. And the bottom line is that certain parties have just they pay lip service to it, but they
Sure.
just have no intention of following it. And we just saw it, if by the time this podcast airs,
Yeah.
it'll be a couple weeks old now, but
Yeah.
we had, the Straits of Hormuz were open, and then the next day they were shut down again, and
Right.
Iran is right back to its old tricks because it has no intention of accepting anything on our terms.
So when the Pope makes a statement about, we just need to like be in peace with each other, who is he primarily talking? Or like that's the thing, is he just sort of throwing in other words, it seems like, well, yeah, of course, right? But who is he talking to?
Well, I think he's trying to talk to everybody. I mean, I think that's the Pope's responsibility as the vicar of Christ on earth, is to speak the message and the words of peace that, we might assume, because we filter things through our own politics, that if he says something that opposes the position of our government, he therefore is making a statement that is exclusively targeted at our government.
Right.
But that
right,
statement is just as applicable to the government of Iran and all of the terrorist groups around the world. It might not feel that way because of how things get filtered through our news cycle,
Yeah.
but we always forget as Americans, I think, that the Pope is trying to govern a universal church, and his purview is the whole world.
Yeah.
He doesn't sit around and spend more time thinking about the problems of the United States than any other country.
Right.
In fact, he probably spends more time worrying about most of the other countries of the world because by and large, the United States is in pretty good shape as a country.
Yeah.
And we might create some problems by some of our policies, for the church. Maybe, think about like the abortion issue, or you might think of, some of the issues that come down the pipe that deal with life issues, of which war is one of those.
Yeah.
What happens is as Americans, we listen to the way these statements are made. It gets filtered through our news, through either the right or the left or whatever.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it sounds like the Pope sits around all day long watching our news and wanting to make statements that are just
Right.
relevant to us. He's just looking around. He's hearing from all the ambassadors and all the cardinals all over the world, and he's trying to address the most pressing issues of a global church and a global a world that is so interconnected.
Yeah.
And it's very complex.
Well,
And
isn't it true that like in a parish on a micro level, the pastor of that parish, every soul, whether they're Catholic or not, kind of are under his shepherd, his shepherding.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a good reminder for me, even when the Pope says something, that it's not, because I'm sitting here like, well, yeah, of course. But, he's actually, his shepherding of the human race extends to everybody, not just, he's not just speaking to Catholics whenever he's speaking. Like,
and he's not just
so
speaking
whether
to
they like
Americans.
it or not, yeah, whether
American
they like it or
Catholics.
not,
Yeah.
he's kind of, his job, his role is really to be speaking the truth to every single person who's kind of under his care, whether they like it
and
or
really,
know it
that's
or
every
not.
human soul.
Right, exactly. Okay.
I mean,
I just wanted to make sure that
again, looking at the basic structure of the church, Christ is king. You could say that the Pope is his viceroy, like his voice, his ambassador on earth, or his prime minister on earth. He doesn't actually have the authority. It's a participated authority. And we, as Catholics, believe that when the Pope is speaking, he's speaking on behalf of Christ. Now, sometimes he does that in an official capacity on matters of faith and morals in a doctrinal sense. And other times he does that just as a pastor who's making a pastoral appeal to the people of goodwill around the earth. So what he's been doing is saying, look, war is not a good that should ever be loved or sought for its own sake. The damage that is done by war is generational. It takes generations to heal from these kinds of
Right.
wounds. So he also would say, vis-a-vis the church's magisterial teaching, that we understand that in a defensive posture, there are times in which you have to take up arms to defend yourself. But so fighting sometimes is inevitable or it's necessary, because we live in a fallen world where there are evil people that have evil intentions,
Yeah.
and we do have a right to defend ourselves against that. But that principle of self-defense is a subordinate principle to a greater principle, which is the command to love. And therefore, we tolerate certain things, certain evils at times, because we have to, and we have certain rights of acting in the face of evil, and therefore no one would object to that. The question then comes down to, well, how do you discern, or how do you decide when it's okay to take up arms and when it's not?
Right.
And that's what the theory of self-defense and just war is all about. But I just think that we lose sight of the fact that he's trying to speak to the whole world and not just to America and the American news cycle. But it creates these kerfluffles. So then, Trump or J.D. Vance make a comment, and then now the Pope's kind of forced to clarify his comments and make a response. And quite honestly, as a Catholic, I have to say, I mean, Trump has put his foot in his mouth pretty well, with his little meme of him being Jesus, and he's been trying to dig himself out of that mess, which has been, it's like sometimes you just say, just put the shovel down, just put the shovel down, move on, and then J.D. Vance, he was waxing eloquent, about the Pope just sticking to moral matters and not getting involved in politics,
policy,
as though war is not a moral question. But that's an eye roll. You're like, really? I can't believe you just said that. You didn't mean what you just said. But but whatever. I mean, this is the problem when you're in front of a camera and people are asking you questions, and you're all of a sudden supposed to speak about really weighty, grave matter, with some little comment from the hip, and then it just becomes this big kerfluffle in the news, and you're just like, it's exasperating.
But you're right. They're taking it as like a hypercriticism of them and what they're doing. It's almost like, well, if they're so confident in what they're doing, why can't their response just be, we are seeking peace, and just let it at that?
It certainly sounded defensive, but I mean, even Pope Leo sounded, honestly, in his own way, sounded a little defensive to me too. And again, it's good because there's been some clarifications. We retracted the meme, and there's been some attempts to say respectful things to one another. But the whole problem is that these issues are very complex, and I'm just trying to remind our listeners, that we have to always keep in mind that when the U.S. government is taking a stand or speaking on anything, it's doing so from a particular purview. That is, we have a certain set of responsibilities and obligations in terms of what a government of a country is supposed to be attending to. And the Pope has his, Rome has its purview as well. And so we just have to keep that in mind and realize that when the Holy See says something that seems to oppose something that's going on in our country, he's speaking to universal principles that in a general sense are binding on everybody, regardless of who you're from, where you're from, and who you are. And he's trying to speak to a whole planet of humans, who come from very different contexts and are dealing with lots of different problems in the world that may not make the U.S. news circuit. So we just...
No, I love the clarification or the breakdown of the temporal versus spiritual. That's really good. That's really good. I want to, we started off by, this is great. We're talking about all these things that are sort of going on in the world, but I want to know a little bit more about what exactly Jesus says about peace.
Oh, so we're gonna actually
Well, I think
circle back on
here,
this.
yeah, and I think we
That's
should
good.
because we're touching on, I think, a lot of potentially really enlightening and personally applicable, things that have to do with peace. Like the situation in the Middle East right now. I always feel like these things are kind of macrocosms of what's going on in us.
Yes.
Like so I'm kind of interested in really knowing your take on what Jesus says about peace, how that relates not just to the world but also to individuals, families,
Yeah.
towns,
Yeah, no, I think these principles apply in many contexts, and that, I think that was well stated. Um, well, let's dive into that. Let me start with a handful of things that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. So, just really quick to tick off the different sayings that Jesus says, and then we can unpack them. So Jesus has a whole teaching on the problem of a kind of hateful anger. Okay, and basically condemns that, and we can talk about that. And then he tells us things like turn the other cheek when someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other. When someone wants to, your cloak, your coat, give them your your tunic as well, or presses you into 1 mile of service if the military.
I've given away so many tunics in my life.
When the military presses you into 1 mile of service, go 2. And then he says that we should love our enemies and we should pray for those who persecute us. Elsewhere he says if those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And then he also makes this very, very opaque reference to the two swords. And that seems to, you could probably loosely tie in, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God. That's saying. So those are kind of like, that's the
Sounds
constellation.
very pacifistic.
Yes, and that's good that you brought that word up, because I think part of the problem is that there's a certain school of pacifism that's emerged within Christian circles that, in fact, I don't think can function in any sort of official capacity of the church's teaching. There are elements of pacifism which are part of the Christian gospel, but a kind of strict pacifism that is where we are never permitted ever to use coercive means or any kind of force or violence to thwart evil is just not church teaching. The church has never taught that. And there are some Christians who demand that Jesus' teaching requires that of every Christian, that we should all be pacifists in that sense, that we can only use nonviolent resistance to oppose evil, as if the church does not have a teaching about self-defense, which the church has had a teaching about self-defense.
But somebody might say, well, Jesus didn't say that. Jesus didn't say, unless you're defending yourself, right? So
right, he
yes.
didn't. But we also, again, we have to put Jesus' teaching into some context, and that's where I think, and we have to make sure we understand the meaning of what he's teaching.
Okay.
So let's dive into that. So obviously, starting with the root issue of anger is that he's not there talking about the emotion of anger. It's really important because people might say, oh, well, Jesus is saying we can never be angry. And I always say, well, was Jesus ever angry?
Yeah, he flipped some tables in his life.
So yes, he's been angry. So there's a difference between a kind of righteous anger where one becomes angry in the face of evil and actually takes an aggressive action against it. I mean, he clearly does there.
Yeah.
Versus an unrighteous anger that is, where you become hateful towards another person and will evil to them or for them because you hate them. You hate like you have no sense of a person's dignity or their value as a human being. And so Jesus says, basically he says, if your anger, leads you to say raka to your brother, and that's like, in our parlance, that would be like saying F you, like that's, if you come to that kind of, contempt for another person, you've crossed the line. Now, he also talks about how, he then says, well, okay, so what are you supposed to do when you find yourself extremely angry with your neighbor? What are you supposed to do? And he says, well, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and this is what kind of sets up his whole teaching on this. That was in the Old Testament period, an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth was a standard by which you were trying to mitigate the escalating effect of feuds. It's very common throughout the history of humanity for there to be either, family or tribal or even dynastic feuds.
Mm-hmm.
And the violence just escalates. It just keeps getting higher and higher. And so in the Old Testament, there was a rule laid down, that you can only punish your enemies, in an equivalent, proportionate manner. If they take your eye out, you can poke their eye out. You can't take their head off. It's and
sounds
that
reasonable,
right? So Jesus says, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." Okay, he says, if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn and give them the other, and then love your enemies.
Yeah.
And then throughout the Gospels, he talks about how it's important to forgive those who persecute you. Okay, so what's he driving at here? And I want to just bracket out for the time being the church's teaching on self-defense. And I want to try to take these teachings just on their own terms,
Okay.
without trying to qualify them by an appeal to self-defense.
Okay.
Okay, so when Jesus, we know that Jesus subjected himself to the judgment of what we would otherwise call legitimate authorities.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he did that.
Yeah.
Right? He told, do everything that Moses prescribed. Moses prescribed. Listen to what the Pharisees and the Sadducees do, what they command you. Just don't follow their example, he says.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Jesus believed in giving obedience, and the New Testament in multiple places says that we should, obey higher authorities.
Right.
And we should be honorable and upright in our conduct as citizens by respecting the law. Now, both Jesus and Paul and Peter all talk about this in the New Testament, and they're not talking about good leaders here. They're not talking about benevolent.
Right.
They're talking about very tyrannical people.
Sure.
And he says, wherever we are obligated to follow the law and respect authority, because that the legitimate authority comes from God. And so we need to subject ourselves to those higher authorities peaceably and be upright citizens of whatever commonwealth we live in. Okay, so what he's saying is that there are situations you're going to find yourself in where the legitimate authorities are not doing what is just.
Right.
So what do you do in that situation? And he's saying, don't resort to revolution. Okay, because if you turn over the existing authority, what you end up doing is you undermine the legitimacy of temporal authority altogether.
Okay.
So that if you become the vigilante, the Batman character who's
Right.
going to take the law into their own hands, you are going to create a situation which is worse than the situation you're dealing with, because you will destroy any possibility of stability.
Yeah.
So there are abuses that you might need to tolerate, and you might need to appeal to a higher authority, and that higher authority is God. At the end of the day, sometimes we just have to let God take care of situations when those who have been appointed as our temporal authorities are abusing that authority. And so the church's teaching on revolution is it's almost never permitted.
Yeah.
Okay? It's even, I think, even more stringent and restrictive than the teaching on just war. So the Jesus' teaching on turning the other cheek is basically a teaching to not undermine legitimate structures of authority by taking matters into your own hand in some sort of vigilante or maverick style, because that will result in something worse than what you're dealing with.
So can I interject?
Yep.
So just to clarify, because I think this is super important, when Jesus makes these statements, he's talking to the individual, not the collective. Right?
No, I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
He's talking
wow.
to individuals, but again, I'm not going to talk about self-defense yet.
But what I'm saying
Okay.
is the expectation for him is first and foremost that individually this should be our stance. Like, in other words, he's not saying Now, governments, you need to turn the other cheeks.
Well,
you
yes,
know?
I would agree with that. Yes.
Okay.
He's not removing the sword of justice from the hands of temporal
Right.
authority.
So the reason I'm saying that is because I think sometimes we can have a tendency to think that this was sort of applicable to, like, the ruling powers or whatever versus individuals. Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I what I'm pushing back on a little bit is I don't want to make the distinction between individuals versus, say, governments. Because I think that, and this is where the mistake comes in, Jesus is not saying we just have to be a doormat in the face of violence. And that's what we think he means. What he's saying is, don't take matters into your own hands when you don't have the authority to do it. We have to respect the structures of authority. Certain people are vested with the authority to wield the sword of justice, and therefore allow God to deal with them. Don't you deal with them, because when you deal with them, there will be no temporal authorities. It will be a perpetual state of revolution, and that will be worse than the occasional times in which you have to tolerate an abusive ruler.
Okay.
That's what he's saying.
Gotcha.
And it's a different thing than saying, oh, well, when people are abusing me, I just have to let them abuse me.
Right.
There are just times in which we are going to suffer abuse, and the temptation is going to be, well, if you're not going to do your job, then I'll do your job for you.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is that will never end well. And the church has been very clear about her teaching about revolution all the way through. And that's why he says, look, if soldiers press you in for a mile of service, go 2 miles with them. Don't try to fight that battle, because in the end you'll lose, and in losing you will create a perpetual state of violent instability.
Yeah.
So, and that's hard. Okay, and again, I'm going to talk about self-defense at the end.
Sure.
But it's the principle is when you're a private person or a private entity, you don't have the right to wield the sword of justice, generally speaking. It's not, because then it just becomes the Wild West, so to speak. That's why
it's anarchy,
even in the Wild West, we needed we needed to deputize people to bring law and order, because you can't have you just end up with utter chaos.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's turning the other cheek, okay. Then love your enemies. Okay. What he's saying, what he's trying to teach us there is that, first of all, again, we are not the ones ultimately to execute justice upon the evil ones that afflict us. God will take care of that, either in this life or the next. He will. But I think more importantly, we have to realize that every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. And while God hates all sin, not just our enemies' sin, but all sin, okay, he also loves every person too. And he desires the repentance and the reform of every single person.
Yeah.
And so Jesus does not, Jesus, he says, I don't come to condemn the world, I come to save the world. And he dies on the cross in order to save us. And so just as God has chosen to love his enemies and try to save and redeem them, he's saying, if you want to be a child of your heavenly Father, then you must do what my Son has done, which is you need to love your enemies just as I have, because I desire their reform and their repentance. And, whatever justice will be meted out by me, not by you, ultimately. Ultimately.
Yeah.
Now, we can talk about civil justice, and maybe we can get to that, if we have time. But that's loving your enemies is seeing, in one sense, seeing in your enemy another self. Like, I always say, if not for the grace of God, I would be that person.
Yeah.
But God hates all sin, even my own, and he loves every sinner, and he wills the good of every sinner, because he ultimately, has willed and has acted so as to bring about the salvation of every person. So we never have permission. If we're children of our Heavenly Father, we don't have permission. we're not exempt from that standard. We should love our enemies. That, again, that doesn't mean that we should allow our enemies to abuse us. Okay? All right? Then he says, forgive those who, from your heart, forgive those who harm you. Okay? Well, again, our Father in heaven has forgiven us from the cross. We've all been forgiven by the death of Jesus. And so, God ultimately wants to put an end to all strife and all conflict. And the only path towards that kind of peace and that kind of healing is we have to forgive each other. Even when we've been harmed, by people doing things that are terrible and awful to us, the only way to work towards a world where that doesn't happen is through the power of forgiveness. And God the Father has shown that to us. Like, that's the way. If you want peace, if you want healing, you can't hold a grudge against people. Obviously, God the Father could hold a grudge against us for all the things that we all do, but he doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can see where I'm going with all of this. It's like, the standard is, if you want to deal with the problem of evil, you can do it in my way, or you can do it in your stupid ways, which never solve anything, but just make the problem worse.
Yeah.
And then finally is no, I think I covered them all.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's when you talk about Jesus' teaching on peace. Okay,
yeah.
it's check the hate, the anger that leads to hate. Like, not okay.
Yeah.
Your anger has to be righteous.
Yeah.
Secondly, don't take matters into your own hands. But when you can't do anything about it because those entrusted with the powers of justice abuse you, you have to appeal to a higher court. Let God take care of it. Third, love your enemies because God does. Forgive those who have harmed you because God has. And yeah.
So
I always feel like I'm missing one. I think that's it.
That's what show notes are for. To cover the forgotten stuff. What do you do if you? So this is good. I mean, because all of these things that you're saying, even in my own life, whenever they start to, when I know that my anger has crossed the line, to where it becomes like this desire to, inflict pain on somebody else, that's when I lose my peace. I mean, I feel like anybody who has done any amount of self-reflection can understand that.
Sure.
Like, it. You're like, oh man, I have totally lost my peace. Same thing. All of these things. Not, like whenever you're holding grudges on people, you're like, there's an internal turmoil that's going on, and it. Like, people, if you're honest with yourself, it. So this all makes sense. What do you do if you're a person who is in some type of position of authority? Like, if let's say you're an elected official and you're Catholic, like, how do you, because you it seems like you're trying to live in this balance of two different kinds of things. The personal call, right, that Jesus is talking about, but then also this sort of temporal authority world. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That seems like a difficult space to live in.
Yeah. No, I mean, obviously we live in a very messed up world, and it's hard to know how to act. And I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt my train of thought here because I remember the other one. There was another one.
Oh, there is another one.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's pray for those who persecute you.
Okay.
Yeah, to pray for them. So pray for their conversion, pray for the coming to their senses and seeing the evil of their ways.
Yep,
So
good.
And of course Jesus does that.
Of course, yeah.
So he shows us the example. This is how you destroy the power of evil, is by the power of love that's expressed in these ways. But back to your question again, I find myself wanting to resist against the private-public distinction, but I do think that we have to. I think the way into answering your question is to talk about boundaries. Okay, we live in a physical world, and there are legitimate boundaries. And this goes back to what we talked about a couple episodes ago about about justice, what's mine versus what's yours. In a just society, we talk about peace and justice. Well, there's no peace without justice, and with justice, we have to respect boundaries. That is, we have to respect what belongs to you and what belongs to me. So one way of looking at both the problems that we can struggle with on a private and personal level, or in a collective social level of things, is the fact that we don't respect the boundaries, the legitimate boundaries of what belongs to you and what belongs to me. And there's all sorts of ways that we violate or transgress that boundary. This is why, by the way, we have different property. Like we have property that's mine versus yours, and whether that's a piece of land that my house sits on, or whether it's my my clothing, or it's my car, or whatever I possess, whatever is rightfully mine belongs to me, and you can't just take it or damage it or abuse it. And of course, we can say that about our bodies. My body is mine. My soul is mine. So if you're going to emotionally abuse me, the question is do I have a right to safeguard my boundary and remove myself, if I can, from the abuse that I'm suffering? And of course, the answer is yes. I have that right. I always have the right to safeguard. I can put up a fence in my yard, and I'm not sinning because I don't want people coming onto my property, or I lock my doors at night. Or I carry mace because if someone tries to assault me, I'm going to spray them in the face with mace. We have the right. Now, we also have the right to forego self-defense for the sake of a higher cause. But to not do that is not a sin.
Gotcha.
Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I might die as a martyr by choosing a peaceful, nonviolent way of bearing witness.
Right.
And I can lay down my life for the sake of a higher cause, but that doesn't negate my right to defend myself when someone has trespassed on the boundary that I legitimately constitutes my individual unique existence. Like it's like you don't get to abuse me mentally, emotionally, physically. And a society and a community is just an extension of everybody's physical, mental, emotional boundaries.
Yeah.
We come together as a collective to provide safety and security in our community so that we can all live with a peace of mind, a peace of heart, and the safety and security of our own bodies. That's why we have a police force. That's why we have a fire department. That's why we have government. We have an army. We have, all of these different, neighborhood watch groups, and we have security cameras. None of that, while it can be excessive sometimes by people that are driven by maybe excessive paranoia or fear, the bottom line is it comes from the fundamental first principle of the natural law, which is the right or the inclination to self-preservation. So when Jesus teaches us not to, to turn the other cheek, he's not at the same time saying you no longer have a right to protect yourself. He's just not talking about that at all. People who think that are wrong. So anytime people kind of try to construct a framework of peace and a kind of pacifism that excludes resorting to coercive or physical violent means for defending yourself or protecting what your borders, your boundaries. They're not arguing reason, and they're not arguing the gospel, because the gospel and reason will not and cannot contradict themselves on this way.
So that's a great
this issue.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. There's obviously Scripture isn't, from my understanding, like black and white or explicit about this idea of self-preservation or self-defense, but that's
It's
something
implied.
that's more like revelation of like the Holy Spirit, from the Holy Spirit, of like natural law, right? You use the word
Yeah, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
Self-love self-preservation is implied in the commandment.
Mm.
So there's just no world that we could construct for ourselves where allowing people with impunity to violate what is rightfully ours is okay.
Yeah.
It's just like that offends human dignity on every count. There's no way Jesus could be in favor of that.
Unless you choose that, like you said.
Yes,
Right.
I can choose to lay down my life for the sake of a higher cause. I always have that right too. But by exercising that right, I'm not foregoing my right to self-defense.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Or to, it's not just self-defense, because I think when you think of self-defense, you think of someone attacking you,
Right.
and you're shielding yourself against the onslaught of someone's attack.
Mm-hmm.
But I have the right to have a boundary, and I have a right to create a to have a boundary that people can only cross when I give them permission to.
Mm.
You don't get to touch any part of my body when you walk past me. You don't get to say anything that you want to. You don't have a right to do that. We might tolerate some things,
Yeah.
but other things we really don't. Like, like why do people get in? If a guy goes and slaps a girl's butt in the workplace, hello, like, that's not okay. But if a fellow football player goes up and slaps the butt of the opponent on the other team, we're okay with that, because the intention behind that is totally different.
Yeah.
It's one is a affirmation, the other one is a violation. You see, so we have boundaries.
Yeah.
And we do because we're physical. Again, there's a distinction between what's mine and what's yours. So you don't get to transgress all over me. And therefore, the turning the other cheek is not Jesus' way of saying, look, in order to be my disciple, you have to be a doormat. And it's like, it has to do with what do you do when people in authority are abusing you, and there's really nothing you can do.
Yeah.
You turning the other cheek is you stand against, but if you take the coercive power of the sword into your own hand when you're not authorized to do so, you're going to make the matter worse.
I think what, just, maybe some last, because, it's always so much. But, I'm trying to play devil's advocate in a sense of what's going on. Yeah, let's go back to the Middle East. Like some people would make the argument that Iran has the right to self-defense. Like the U.S. is seen as the aggressor, even though the U.S. is like making the same argument. No, this is an act of self-defense on our part, because they're, they've shown that they're the bully of the world by, funding terrorism and trying to get a nuclear weapon. And but then Iran could be like, well, they just totally attacked us out of nowhere. Like, we need to act in self-defense. Like, it's sometimes it seems a little bit more clear who's on the right side of things to me. But I imagine there's situations where it becomes very muddy and gray as to like who is practicing these things in the best, most moral kind of way.
Well, sure. I mean, like, let me put it this way. We don't go around and destroy willy-nilly the militaries of just about any other country, because we acknowledge that every nation has the right to self-defense. So there must be something different going on in this situation that would compel us to do what we've done. And that has to be Iran's intentions to attack, other countries with nuclear weapons, or, we could think of enemies wanting to use biological weapons. And we're saying we cannot live in a world where that's a possibility. So it's like there must be some compelling reason why we would, like, we're not just saying, well, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, we don't like Iran, so we're going to go beat up on them.
Right.
It's like that's ridiculous. Something had to have provoked it. And, it's interesting when you go into the situation in Ukraine. There's long-standing historical disputes about territory, what belongs to the Russians, what belongs to the Ukrainians, and all of that. Well, the bottom line is at this point in time, we recognize Ukraine as a sovereign nation, the community of nations has, and we've acknowledged that this is the border of that country. It doesn't matter what it was 100 years ago, Putin.
Yeah.
It matters what it is today and what the international community has more or less agreed upon. So you're not entitled to go take back what you think rightfully belongs to you. Because again, where does that end?
Right.
Like everybody's owned everything at some point. Like, how do you? It's fascinating. I told you before, I've been reading this book on the history of Western civilization, and of course that's the history of the entire Mediterranean world, honestly. But I mean, people move around so much; it's unbelievable, and conquer. And now it's like, how did these people that lived way up near Russia, they're like in control of southern Spain and North Africa? Like, how did that happen? Like just because people move around and they take over stuff, well, that's history.
Yeah.
So does Ukraine have the right to defend itself? Yeah, it's a sovereign nation. It has the authority vested within itself as a legitimate state to be able to defend itself.
Yeah.
And other nations around the world can choose to support that effort or not, whether it's in their best interest or not. And we don't have to get behind every cause, because not every cause is in our interest.
Yeah.
But if it is in our interest, then sure, we should help them, because Russia is an unjust aggressor. And they just don't have a right to do what they're doing, according to, But if to make a moral equivalency between what Russia did and what the United States is doing in Iran is not to attend to the actual reality on the ground and what's really been going on there. It's just not the same. It's apples to oranges.
Yeah, that's just goofy.
So, again, the same principles of peace apply, but I think that I'll end by saying that I didn't really want to rehash self-defense all over again, because we've talked about it before, but I just want to say that, because we have boundaries that are legitimate, and in order to secure justice, that is, we have to safeguard what rightfully belongs to me and what rightfully belongs to you. Self-defense is a principle that has to be operative within social relationships, whether they're individuals or whether it's communal or even international. You have to have the right to defend the violation of those boundaries that have been established. Boundaries are fluid, when it comes to nations. The borders can move around, but the boundary of my body doesn't. There's just certain things that you're never permitted to do, with my mind, my emotions, or any part of me. And we have the right to defend ourselves when we can. And then there are certain rules that apply to what is morally okay for me to do when I'm defending myself. And that criteria is just basically, I can't use disproportionate force. I mean, if someone comes at me with a knife, I can't shoot their head off with a bazooka.
Yeah.
So there's a proportionality, but I am allowed to use coercive force, in defending myself, and so is a nation. And so, we have to look at the circumstances of the particular case to determine when it truly is self-defense, and then we have to look at what's okay and what's not okay in the act of self-defense. So I mean, again, we've done podcasts on this. I'd refer the listener to go back and maybe listen to those specific podcasts. But I think that what I want to end by saying is that Jesus' teaching on peace, he makes a statement: those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And people who do that are people who abuse their power to always get their way by using violence as a way of doing that. And of course, that's obvious that that's not okay, but that doesn't mean that a person can't use a sword in the cause of self-defense. That's not what he's referring to. Okay. And then the two swords doctrine is basically saying, look, there's a separation of powers, and legitimate temporal authority, that is government, has the right. Even Paul acknowledges it. Peter acknowledges it in his letter. temporal authorities have the right to wield the sword of justice for the sake of maintaining the common good and peace. It's a limited authority. It's not unlimited.
Yeah, right.
Not all things belong in the hands of temporal government, but this is common sense. We know this. The church knows this. The church teaches this and believes this. So you can never use Jesus' teaching on peace and what we went through today as a justification for never being able to use any form of violence or coercion in the cause of self-defense.
So good. Is that your wrap-up?
Sure. Let that be the wrap-up.
All right, man.
Yeah, okay. Well, complicated matters, all of these things. Hopefully this episode has been helpful just to understand what Jesus really means in the Sermon on the Mount, particularly when he talks about things like, hateful anger, turning the other cheek, loving our enemies, praying for those who persecute us, and so forth. Jesus is not teaching us that we are not permitted to defend ourselves or that we just have to be a doormat and give people permission to abuse us whenever they feel like it. We always have the right to lay down our life for other people for the sake of a greater cause, but we always have the right to defend ourselves and to protect what rightfully belongs to us. So hopefully this has been helpful to you. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next episode.
See ya.
The Wise Guys Podcast is a production of Preambula Group, a Catholic ministry dedicated to helping you thrive in the heart of Jesus. Visit us on the web at preambula.org and follow us on social media.